Hello, in this video we're going to compare very briefly the LM and RT approaches to analyzing monetary policy. Now, you have already been introduced to two important tools to help you analyze monetary policy. The LM, or liquidity money curve, is a traditional tool, and it is based on equilibrium in money markets. The RT, or real Taylor rule, that approach, shows us that a monetary policy rule that is explicitly related to specific central bank objectives. In fact, the two tools are not so different. We're going to see that in this video. But as a business person who needs to understand your macroeconomic environment and your central bank's policies, the RT approach will likely be a more helpful tool for you in your day-to-day thinking. So this video is going to help you understand why you should be interested in the RT curve as well as the LM curve. So let's start with some key similarities. Both the LM curve and the RT curve are upward sloping in output and interest rate space. So here is the LM curve as we already introduced it. On the horizontal axis is the output gap. On the vertical axis is the interest rate. And we can see that as the output gap increases, so does the interest rate. Likewise, over here for the RT curve, we have the output gap in percent of potential output, same as in the LM curve. And we have the interest rate, and again, an upward sloping curve. Now, one of the key insights of the LM curve is that along this curve, money markets are in equilibrium at all points. So it would be a natural question to ask, is that the case for the RT curve? And the answer is yes. So both curves reflect equilibrium in money markets. Now, we previously learned that the LM curve summarizes an interest rate rule that is designed to stabilize the economy. Although we've argued, and we will further argue, that that's an implicit rule. But in this case, the central bank will choose to raise interest rates when economic activity rises. In the other direction, when economic activity falls along the LM curve, the central bank chooses to reduce interest rate in an effort to reactivate or heat up the economy. It turns out that's pretty much the same logic we have with the RT curve. But the thinking behind the LM curve is very different from the thinking behind the RT approach, and that's very important. The LM curve is not explicitly generated from any real-world policy objective. Instead, what did we do? We generated the LM curve by assuming that the central bank keeps the money supply fixed, and we showed that when output increased, money demand increased. We moved from a point like A to a point like B, and since the money supply was held constant, that meant that the interest rate had to rise. In the other direction, suppose that output fell, that means that money demand would fall, and that means since once again the central bank has kept the money supply constant, the interest rate has to fall. So we can see that points A, B, and C lie along this line an infinite number of combinations of output gap and interest rate that satisfy money market equilibrium. So this policy of keeping the money supply constant, even in the face of changing demand for money, is one that we could call a policy of no accommodation. Well, guess what? A robot could perform this function. And here's our robot. It's true that this robot's naive rule, and we have to emphasize that the robot has no objective and it knows nothing about the economy, but it does bring about a desired result, an implicit policy rule that stabilizes the economy. When output rises, the central bank raises interest rates in order to cool down the economy. And when output falls, the central bank reduces interest rates in order to reactivate or heat up the economy. So there is an implicit rule here, but it turns out that this rule is a kind of a crude one, and it can give some misleading results. And we are typically better off if our policies are linked to some sort of explicit objective. Well, in fact, as a matter of contrast, the RT curve is explicitly derived from real-world policy objectives. These objectives are to stabilize prices, that is, to keep inflation at or near some target, and output, that is, to keep the output gap at or close to zero. Again, along the RT curve, when output rises, the central bank is going to raise interest rates in order to cool down the economy. But when output falls, the central bank is going to reduce interest rates in order to reactivate or heat up the economy. Now, it turns out that, no surprise, people, not robots, run central banks. People like these, they have to explain their policy decisions that they make. Their explanations will correspond to the objectives that underpin the real Taylor curve, and really much more so than the LM curve. The LM curve has relatively little to say about that. We often want to assess the stance of monetary policy. What do we mean by the stance? Well, when we talk about a loose monetary policy stance or an expansionary stance, that's one that's geared to stimulating economic activity to a greater extent that is consistent with the central bank's objectives and also consistent with given circumstances. In the other direction, a tight or contractionary monetary policy stance is one that is geared towards restraining economic activity, again to a greater extent than is consistent with the central bank's objectives or the given circumstances. So a neutral monetary policy stance is one that is geared towards meeting the central bank's objectives, a policy that is neither too tight nor too loose for given circumstances. Now, judging whether monetary policy is loose or tight or neutral, it can be a difficult task, especially because the economic conditions and circumstances are constantly changing. But the real Taylor framework is a little bit more well suited to help us put some numbers to the concept of the monetary policy stance, loose or tight or neutral. It's going to be a little bit more helpful. When we make this assessment of monetary policy stance, we essentially compare the observed interest rate that we see with the interest rate that's prescribed by the Taylor rule for given economic circumstances. Is it less than, greater than, or equal? So if what we observe is less than what the Taylor rule prescribes, then we would say that the monetary policy is loose or expansionary for given circumstances. If the observed interest rate is above the interest rate prescribed by the Taylor rule for given circumstances, then monetary policy is tight or contractionary for given circumstances. But if the observed interest rate is equal to the interest rate prescribed by the Taylor rule, then we would say that the monetary policy is neutral. It is consistent with the Taylor rule given the economic circumstances. So the Taylor rule is better suited than the LM curve to evaluate monetary policies of the central bank, whether monetary policies are tight or loose. And we can make this calculation. This graph is from chapter 11 of the book, and we can see here the red line is what we observed, the blue dashed line is what the Taylor rule would have given us. So it turns out that, let's say during the high inflation 70s, the observed interest rate was substantially less than what the Taylor rule would have told us. So we can conclude that inflation was high during this period because monetary policy was loose. We can find other periods when monetary policy was loose, when the blue dashed line is above the red solid line, but we can also find some periods when monetary policy was tight, including during the recent financial crisis. So in other materials, that includes videos and spreadsheet-based exercises and the book, We'll show you how to make these explicit calculations. They may be of interest to you. But we should also mention that to judge the stance of monetary policy, we shouldn't be focusing entirely on the interest rate. Traditional approaches, traditional economists have always emphasized that we need also to look at the growth of money itself. And these are important approaches, and we shouldn't forget them. They can also yield important insights, and they can also tell us important information as to what's going on. Now, we want to mention other differences between the LM and RT approaches. The degree of monetary accommodation, as we mentioned, LM is no accommodation. The RT is something that we call partial accommodation. It also turns out that the LM curve has pretty much disappeared from modern macroeconomic models, but the RT curve, or something like it, appears in modern macroeconomic models. But we're going to leave these aspects to other videos. So that's it. Take care.